Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
That's what happened when you're in the wilderness, right? Dragonfly.
Hallelujah.
Ain't no powerful reinforcement.
Hallelujah.
So we will talk about the scriptures today. I put subject during Tabernacle to talk about the scriptures. And I want to take a look at the Septuagint version. Give you a little background on that. May be aware that at the time of Yeshua, there were two scriptures available for people to read. The Greek version, called the Septuagint, translated about 280 BC, and the Hebrew version, which they refer to as the Masoretic version because it was promoted by the Masoretes through a religious sect. And it's interesting that Yeshua and the apostles seem to have exclusively used the Greek Septuagint version, which is curious because they certainly could read and understand Hebrew, but they used the Greek version. And that should kind of make us interested in why they thought that was the version they should use, since almost everyone today in our churches uses a Masoretic version. That includes the King James and all the other translations that you can pick up anywhere at a bookstore. The Septuagint is very seldomly used or quoted from, and yet we know from quotations that the apostles used and Yeshua used that they were quoting exactly from the Septuagint. So I want to give a introduction here on the background of Septuagint. The history of the Septuagint is shrouded in a certain amount of mystery. According to an account by Aristeas, a distinguished officer in the service of Ptolemy Philadelphia, Ptolemy, hearing of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, from Demetrius Phaleras, whom he had appointed librarian of his new Alexandrian library. By the way, Alexandrian library was on the coast of Egypt in the city of Alexandria, which was a Greek city. A Greek colony was there, and they had the ancient world's most magnificent library. Large library with lots of scrolls, all of the world's wisdom. And it would be great to have that library available for scholars to peruse today. Unfortunately, in the 7th century AD, the Muslims, as part of their conquest of Egypt, conquered Alexandria and burned the library to the ground. It was not Muslim scriptures, and so they burned, destroyed every one of them. All that ancient wisdom, much of which had no other copies in existence. So it's very sad. What we owe to the Muslims. Anyway, he was desirous of adding such an ancient and sacred volume to his literary treasures. Ptolemy Philadelphus. Being informed by Aristeas that the Jews would not be likely to conform to his wishes, while so large a number of them were kept in the condition of slaves, he expended the enormous sum of 660 talents of silver in ransoming 198,000 of them, and then dispatched Aristeas with an embassy bearing magnificent presents to the high priest Eleazar, and requesting that he would send him a copy of the law of Jerusalem, with some Jewish scholars capable of translating it. 6 were accordingly chosen out of each tribe. On their arrival, the king feasted them for 7 days. Their biblical numerics has always been important to the Hebrew people. Feasted them for 7 days, tested their wisdom by 72 questions, which they answered successfully, and then assigned them a lodging on the shore, in which by combined labor they succeeded in producing their translation in, yes, 72 days. They were very big on numbers. By the time of the Christian era, the current belief, which was unhesitatingly accepted by Irenaeus, an early church historian, and many of the church fathers, was that the translators had all been separated from each other, and in an incredibly short time had each independently translated the entire Old Testament. On comparing the 72 translations, they are found to be verbally identical, and it was therefore a necessary inference that the work could only have been accomplished by the direct inspiration of Elohim. Some ruinous buildings on the shore at Alexandria, shore of the Mediterranean, were pointed out as the actual cells in which the translators had worked, and so general was the credence given to the story that Justin Martyr was actually taken to visit these ruined cells as one of the recognized tourist sites of Alexandria. There were quite a few nice tourist sites in Alexandria, the great Colossus of Rhodes, which was destroyed in ancient times, and many other things. Jerome, with his usual intellectual independence, contemptuously rejects this and points out that even Aristeas does not say a word about any such miracle, the office of translator being wholly different from that of prophet. Jerome, another early church theologian who also translated the Bible into Latin, says that the translators may have had the guidance of the Holy Spirit in their occasional additions to the words of the Hebrew text. So they were aware that there are differences between the Masoretic and the Septuagint. Although for centuries the letter of Aristeas was accepted as genuine, it is now universally believed to be nothing more or less than a spurious work of imagination. The date of its composition is uncertain, but is probably not earlier than 50 years before the Christian era. And if so, it must have been written more than 2 centuries after the events which it professes to relate. And, you know, it's sad that when they did a translation like the Septuagint, nobody made a record of how it was done and the names of the translators, you know, all these kinds of things that we want to know about today. Apparently nobody said a thing about it, at least that survived to this day. It's possible there was something written and put in the library at Alexandria, only to be burned down by the Muslims. So nothing has survived to tell us exactly from that time period how it was translated. The entire narrative and its glaring improbabilities has all the character of a gorgeous romance. And the sophist who wrote it betrays himself by the reckless prodigality of his exaggerations. Yet he built his story on some actual facts. And alike in his book and in the question from another book ascribed to Aristobulus, which is preserved by Clemens of Alexandria, we see that the Jews in the century before Christ believed that the Greek version of the Bible had its origin at Alexandria about BC 280, about 3 centuries before Yeshua, very ancient translation, and that the nucleus of it was formed by the version of the Pentateuch. So the most important part of the Septuagint was the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And thus, much might indeed have been easily conjectured without the aid of any tradition. The Septuagint has a recognized abbreviation of LXX, the Roman numerals for 70. It shows the clearest possible traces of its birthplace in its phraseology, its peculiar inflections, and its intellectual bias. The account of Aristeas that the translators were sent from Jerusalem falls at once to the ground when we notice the peculiarities inherent in the text. Even supposing these to have been familiar with Hellenistic Greek, Jews from Jerusalem would not have represented the Hebrew word ephah by the Egyptian oiphi, or have represented Zaphnath-Paneah, the title you remember bestowed upon Joseph by Pharaoh, the title in Genesis for Joseph, by its proper Egyptian equivalent, Samprampanit, the Egyptian equivalent that was actually used in the text, original text of the Septuagint. Nor again would they have changed the rush into papyrus, nor have introduced the word hippodrome into Genesis 35, verse 19. You're wondering what a hippodrome is. If you remember the wonderful movie Ben-Hur, the famous chariot scene where Charlton Heston's on the chariot race around the arena. Well, the hippodrome was the Greek word for a stadium. And by the way, I'm still amazed that Charlton Heston did not use a stunt double. It was him on that chariot the whole time, risking his life. He did all the stunts himself. Amazing. So Rachel died and was buried in the way of the course of Ephrathah, which is Bethlehem. Still less would they have rendered the word Thummim by truth, and so apparently have identified the gems oracular of the high priest's breastplate with the sapphire pectoral worn by the chief of the Egyptian hierarchy. If these facts are alone decisive for the Alexandrian origin of the Septuagint version, the date may be inferred within certain limits from various allusions in the text. The reference in the prologue of Ecclesiasticus, one of the apocryphal books, shows that most of the Old Testament had been translated before the reign of Ptolemy Euergetes II, BC 170. And in the apocryphal additions to Esther, mention is made of Ptolemy Philometor, BC 181. There is no certain evidence to establish the date of special portions, however. In Joshua 8:18, we find the word Gaisos used for Joshua's spear. An interesting thing about that is that Gaisos was a German Gallic word for a spear or javelin. And the reason for that was that the Egyptians had employed Gothic warriors to help them in their battles, and that took place around 250 to 270 BC, when Gallic mercenaries were employed by the Egypto-Macedonian kings. But the argument is still rather precarious as of an exact date. Beyond these facts, everything else is fairly uncertain. Roman writer Juvenal referred to the Septuagint as the secret volume of Moses. Today it's much of a secret too, because I doubt there are very many people besides me and maybe one or two others here, if that, who have a Septuagint Bible in their home library and use it. The Jews used it in all their synagogues and appointed a feast day in commemoration of its completion. And that's rather funny because they were so joyous at the Septuagint being translated that they actually established a religious holiday, a feast day in honor of the Septuagint. Until, at the time of Yeshua, the apostles began pointing out things in the scriptures that pointed to Yeshua being the Messiah, and suddenly they started regretting that the Septuagint had never been translated, and they established a fast day in regret of the Septuagint having been composed. Oh boy, how things change, huh? So at any rate, it's equally probable that it received its name, the Septuagint, from the number of translators that were so confidently assigned to it in the Romance of Aristeas. We have no idea. If there were 70 translators, it's possible that there was a tradition handed down to the time of Elizabeth, which he may have perhaps embellished slightly. But at any rate, it seems to have been quite a tradition that there were 70 translators. It may perhaps be asked whether these obvious variations in the manuscript lead to any decisive inference as to the date that the present square Hebrew characters came to be employed. Some of you may be aware that there were Proto-Hebrew scriptures that were originally used. They are similar to the Samaritan characters, look a lot like Arabic today. And from what I've read in other places, around the Persian era, some scholars think, there was such animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. You know the story of the Good Samaritan. You know, it's shocking that Yeshua, being a Jew, would say something nice about a Samaritan being a good person. They were so upset with the Samaritans that they decided they were not going to use the same alphabet that those horrible Samaritans were using. So they developed their own square characters, which are used today. However, the rabbis, whoever copied the Bible, whenever they came to the sacred name, they always wrote it in the old Proto-Hebraic characters. They never wrote it in the new square characters. They believed that was something sacred, and the original language was sacred. That's rather interesting. And apparently, it took quite a few years that the new alphabet took to come into play. It wasn't overnight. They didn't say, as of next week, we've got a brand new alphabet for everybody. It probably took a century or two before it was all standard. And because the old characters are still found on coins of the Maccabees as late as a century and a half before Yeshua. And it's equally certain that the old characters were obsolete by the time of Yeshua, because otherwise he could not have given us that wonderful parable where he talked about a story where he said, there was not one jot or one tittle be removed from the law till all things be fulfilled. The jot and the tittle in the current Hebrew characters, the yod is a very tiny character, but in the Samaritan, in the old characters, it were just the same size as all the other letters. So it would make no sense if Yeshua had said that and they're still using the old alphabet. And the Jews call the present Hebrew characters the square or the Assyrian writing, which in Hebrew they call it Asherit or Assyrian. And from this, some scholars have believed that it may have been developed during the Assyrian exile. On the other hand, there are other Hebrew scholars who say, no, that's not true, because the term can also be interpreted as meaning blessed or supported. Asherit could also mean blessed or supported. And so it's not necessarily meaning Assyrian. So there are scholars Jewish scholars on both sides of this issue. So it's unlikely they'll ever agree on which interpretation they think is right. So if the Septuagint could be used to throw light on this question, a perplexing literary problem would be set at rest. But when leading Jewish scholars take opposite sides on the question, controversy must lead its decision to other sources. Now, the importance of the Septuagint early Greek translation was it helped to preclude the falsification of the Old Testament scriptures in the interest of the rabbi or the Pharisaic theology. And that's important because when Christianity came around, they were being deluged by quotations on the Septuagint from the Old Testament, showing that Yeshua was the Messiah who was fulfilling the prophecy. of the arguments that Christian missionaries used in that first century, the one they used the most was one of the Psalms. Guess what Psalm Christian missionaries used the most? What?
119.
On the Torah? No. Christians believe in the Torah, just like the Jews. It was actually Psalm 22. No psalm is more frequently quoted in the New Testament writers in its messianic fulfillments than the 22nd. And the Jews who had freely adopted messianic applications of many psalms long before the Christians came around suddenly didn't see messianic applications in those psalms anymore. And they'd be glad to get rid of such a passage as "they pierced my hands and my feet" from Psalm 22, verse 16. Accordingly, they prefer to corrupt and misinterpret the scriptures by reading Ka'ari like a lion as Karu, they pierce, or vice versa. They prefer to say Karu is Ka'ari, like a lion, in an effort to try and undermine the Christian evangelist message. But they have to change scripture to do it, and it's quite obvious because we can look in the Septuagint and see what the real word is. So I can't get away with that. However, in my next talk, Thursday, I'm going to show you some very interesting information on how they changed the ages of the patriarchs in the English version, King James, and so forth, compared to the Septuagint, in order to try and undermine a Christian argument that was widely used in the first century. So we'll talk about that next time. But interesting to look at Psalm 22 and notice all the places that it's quoted in the New Testament. Amazing number of places that it's quoted. Psalm 22, verse 1. I'm reading from the Amplified version here. It brings out the meaning a little clearer. To the chief musician, set to the tune of Ijaleth Hashashar, the hind of the morning dawn. And it's interesting because time of Yeshua, the Jews were chanting the Psalms. But originally, when they were written, they were not chanted, they were sung. You look through many of the Psalms, and they will tell you in the heading the name of the music that was sung, the Psalm was sung to. And of course, the Psalms are all written in a responsive format. Those who have gone to old line churches know in the back of the hymnal or have the responsive readings, the pastor reads one line, the foundation the next, all the way through. Well, that goes all the way back to the time of Israelite worship in the Bible. The rabbi would read a verse and the congregation would read the next verse. The second verse, in other words, restates a truth in slightly different words as a double witness, as an emphasis of the truth that's being taught. And so if you look at your Psalms and notice the responsive format, it's very interesting and instructive. All the Psalms are in responsive format. So Psalm 22, verse 1, a Psalm of David, says, my Elohim, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? And that's quoted in Matthew 27, verse 46. But I am a worm and no man. I am the scorn of men and despised by the people. Quoted in Matthew 27, verses 39 through 44. Verse 7. All who see me laugh at me and mock me. They shoot out the lips, they shake the head, saying, and that's quoted in Matthew 27, 43. He trusted and rolled himself on Yahuwah that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing that he delights in him. And that's quoted a whole boatload of times in the New Testament. Matthew 27, 39 and 43, Mark 15, 29 and 30, and Luke 23, verse 35. Verse 12, many foes like bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have hedged me in. And that's quoted by Ezekiel in chapter 39 and verse 18. Verse 13, against me they open their mouths wide like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is softened with anguish and melted down within me. Verse 15, my strength is dried up like a fragment of clay pottery. With thirst my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you have brought me into the dusk of death. That's quoted in John 19, verse 28. Verse 16, for like a pack of dogs they have encompassed me. A company of evildoers has encircled me. They pierced my hands and my feet. That's on Isaiah 53, verse 7, and John 19, verse 37. Verse 17, I can count all my bones. The evildoers gaze at me. Quoted in Luke 23, verses 27 and 35. Verse 18, they part my clothing among them and cast lots for my raiment. Raiment was a long shirt-like garment, a seamless undertunic. And that's the parting of the clothing appears in John 19, verses 23 and 24. Verse 22, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise you. And that's quoted in John 20, verse 17, Romans 8:29, and Hebrews 2:12. Verse 23, you who fear Yahuwah, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him. Revere and worship him, all you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, neither has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him, he heard. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to Yahuwah, and all the families of the nations shall bow down and worship before you. There is to be a universal spread of the gospel coming. That's told us over and over again. In Habakkuk 2:14, and also Isaiah quotes it to knowledge of Yahuwah shall cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. Verse 31, they shall come and shall declare his righteousness to a people yet to be born, that it is finished. Quoted in John 19, verse 30. So there are many passages of the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms. Psalms are interesting because they're almost like they were written for under the New Covenant. There's no mention in any of the Psalms about animal sacrifices, nothing like that. But grace is mentioned a lot throughout the Psalms. Very interesting. And a lot of times you'll see some of the organizations will give out copies of the New Testament with the Psalms. It fits right in. So next, let's move on. A couple weeks ago, whatever it was, we were in 1 Samuel chapter 11. And the opening verses are missing in the Masoretic text. All the Masoretic versions, King James and NIV and all those that are Masoretic, are missing the opening verses which explain what's going on. Interesting because the missing text is not in Brenton's English Septuagint version either, but it is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in Dead Sea Scroll corpus number 4Q7. And I found on the archive.org website a interesting article about the Book of Samuel fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it says, have you ever wondered why passages in the Bible sometimes don't seem to make sense on the first or even the second reading? Biblical scholars have come up with a number of explanations for your frustration. The manners and customs of the biblical world are largely alien to us. Some stories, such as the creation in Genesis, appear to be two separate versions of creation woven together. Sometimes stories may not make sense because there's something missing. Part of the text has somehow been lost over the millennia of copying. And of course, in ancient times, they wrote on scrolls, and if one of the scrolls is missing, there goes the text. There is some thought among scholars that there may be a missing scroll to the beginning of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, because it opens rather abruptly without the usual opening greetings and so forth. And So there's some that think there may have been a scroll that got lost or damaged and it's missing, but of course we have no idea. Wouldn't it be great if we could have the lost pieces back? Sure would, including the lost epistles to the Laodiceans that's mentioned in the epistles and we don't have today. In a few cases, the Dead Sea Scrolls offer the missing part of a puzzle. Here's an example. In the story of Saul's rise to kingship, he makes his claim to fame by battling the nasty Nahash the Ammonite, a distant and less civil predecessor of the current monarch of the area, King Hossein of Jordan. When you take a look at most versions of 1 Samuel 11, the narrative will start out something like this. Then Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a treaty with us, and we will serve you. But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, on this condition I will make a treaty with you, that I gouge out all your right eyes, and thus put disgrace upon all Israel. The elders of Jabesh said to him, give us 7 days respite, that we may send messengers throughout all the land of Israel. Then if there is no one to save us, we'll give ourselves up to you. Unquote. Does this make complete sense to you? For over 2 centuries, biblical scholars have been suggesting that the beginning of the story is missing, an essential bit of context that lays down the background for Nahash wanting to poke people in the eye. Before we look at that bit of context, a little background. Nahash ruled on the eastern side of the Jordan, an area where some Israelites were settled, but not in control. Jabesh Gilead was an Israelite-controlled town in this partially Ammonite area, vaguely reminiscent of Israeli enclaves in the territory of the Palestinian Authority today. By telling the able-bodied Israelite men of Jabesh that he wanted their right eyes in return for peaceful relations, Nahash was making a simple statement. You can't effectively fight my soldiers with spear, sword, and bow and arrow if you have no depth perception. With only one eye, you won't. With no effective defensive force, the Israelite enclave east of the Jordan would be doomed. But there's still something missing. There's no introductory context for Nahash's eye-poking shtick. That's where TSS 4Q-SAM comes in, Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's the missing beginning, courtesy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Interesting to me that it's not in the current Septuagint. Well, I'm not sure what's with that, at any rate. Now Nahash, king of the Bani Ammon, or Ammonites, oppressed the Bani Gad and the Bani Reuben with force. They plucked out every right eye. There was no savior for Israel, and there remained not a single man among the Bani Israel beyond the Jordan River, whose right eye Nahash, king of the Bani Ammon, had not plucked out from him. Now there were 7 contingents delivered from his hand of the Bani Ammon. They went to Jabesh Gilead, and so it was about a month later. And then we pick up the text in the Masoretic version in the King James. And the translation I just read was by students of their house Judaica's advanced Hebrew course on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here's the story. Nahash, the Ammonite, was attacking communities of Israelite tribes living on the eastern side of the Jordan, specifically the tribes of Gad and Reuben. To render the Israelites militarily impotent, Nahash was poking out Israelite right eyes like crazy. And most people, of course, are right-handed, right-eyed. So ultimately, the elders went to Saul on the other side of the Jordan. God's spirit Saul to fight. Before long, Nahash the Ammonite was history. How did this beginning passage get lost? All a copyist had to do is skip from the word he was just copying down to the next appearance of the same word, perhaps a few lines lower. It happens frequently enough, so that scholars have given the scribal error a fancy name, homeotaluta. Story on that. Now, we've been in our Saturday studies in 1 Samuel, so I thought to myself I would start going through 1 Samuel and compare the Masoretic text, such as the King James Version, with the Septuagint and see where they differ and what the reason for the differences are. And there are some interesting things I found. I'll have to go through some of them today and then continue. There's too many to cover today on Thursday. For example, in 1 Samuel 14:45, the King James Version says, "And the people said unto Saul, Shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid, or Elohim forbid, as Yahuwah liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he hath wrought with Elohim this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, but he died not. Now, Septuagint has just a slight change which changes the meaning. Septuagint says, "And the people said to Saul, Shall he that has wrought this great salvation in Israel be put to death this day? As Yahuwah lives, there shall not fall to the ground one of the hairs of his head, for the people of Elohim have wrought successfully this day." So whereas the Masoretic says that Jonathan, he wrought with God, but the Septuagint says the people of Elohim interceded for Jonathan. So that makes a lot of sense that the people would have prayed for him, you know. He didn't have to just pray for himself, as the King James puts it. Well, interesting change, but we don't have the original text that the Septuagint was translated from, so we can't say definitively which is the correct version. But that was 1 Samuel 14:45. And the difference was confusion between the Hebrew word im, meaning with, and am, meaning people. I am versus am. And of course, as you may know, Hebrew did not have vowels written. They had to be supplied by the reader from the context. And that's not always easy to do. And so the Masoretic took it as an I am with, and the Septuagint took it as an am, people. And we have other examples of that in the scriptures as well. Genesis 15:11 is an instance of imperfect knowledge. For there, simply by the difference of pronunciation, instead of Abraham drove the fowls away, it says in the Septuagint that he sat down with them. Now, in 1 Samuel 2:16, the King James Version says, "If any man said unto him, Let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take as much as thy soul desireth, then he would answer him, Nay, but thou shalt give it me now, if not, I'll take it by force." The Septuagint changes it slightly. Instead of he would answer him nay, it says then he would say nay. And the reason for that is that the Hebrew word lo, L-O, in English, in Hebrew can mean two different things. It can mean not as a negative, but it can also mean to him, or to this person, depending on which vowels that you use, the lambda aleph or the lambda iota. So in 1 Samuel 2:16, the King James has, he would answer him nay, where the word in their version, they've rendered in both its meanings. They weren't sure which was right, so they put both meanings into the text. That's one way of covering yourself. Then Isaiah 9:3, it said, "Thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy." I always wondered about that. It sounded very strange. It has not increased the joy. They joy before thee, according to the joy of harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. And that's a contradictory statement. He's multiplied the nation, not increased the joy, but they're joyful. You know, it seems logical. They would see that it's a contradiction. Septuagint corrects that, or maybe has the original that didn't have the mistake. the multitude of the people which thou hast brought down in thy joy, they shall even rejoice before thee. Which makes a whole lot more sense. So lo is translated as not in the King James Version, and it's translated they in the Septuagint, both just depending on which vowel you put in one little word. We often will, while every service, we quote Psalm 100. I found interesting if you're saying King James is not correct in one place. Verse 3, know ye that Yahuwah, he is Elohim, is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. The Brenton translation, the Septuagint says, know that Yahuwah, he is Elohim, he made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Now, looking at commentary, they said that Brenton has mistranslated the Hebrew there in the Septuagint, and said the Hebrew actually says, and to him we belong. Know that Yahuwah is Elohim, and to him we belong. Is what the commentators are saying is the proper translation. But so the Brenton English translation Septuagint apparently isn't accurate, and the King James isn't accurate either. Interesting. Now, according to our Bible commentary, it says sometimes indeed it is all but certain that their reading is right, while that of the received Hebrew text, the Masoretic, the King James, is wrong. A conspicuous instance of this we found in 1 Samuel 14:18, where Saul, immediately before a battle with the Philistines, said unto Ahiah, 14:18 in the King James, and Saul said unto Ahiah, bring hither the ark of Elohim. For the ark of Elohim was at that time with the children of Israel. The Septuagint is different. It says, Saul said to Ahiah, bring the ephod, for he wore the ephod in that day before Israel. So King James is saying, bring the ark of Elohim here. The Septuagint is saying, bring the ephod here. So which is right? I checked commentaries, and here's what they say. Now the ark at this time was at Kirjath Jearim, 1 Samuel 7, verses 1 and 2, where it remained from its capture by the Philistines until it was removed by David, 2 Samuel 7. But Saul at this time was at Gibeah, and it is most unlikely that the priests could have ventured to carry a treasure so sacred as the ark for many miles through a disturbed and half-conquered country. And further, the ark would have been perfectly useless for Saul's object, which was, through his hot impatience, though in his hot impatience he did not stop to carry it out, he wanted to ascertain the will of Elohim. Here, therefore, the reading of Septuagint, which is bring hither the ephod, is almost certainly correct, as well for the reason just given, as because the phrase bring hither is always used of the ephod and never used of the ark, and because the only method of inquiring of Elohim was by the Urim and Thummim, which formed part of the ephod. If the two words be written underneath each other, it will be seen at once how small a change in what is called reductus literarum would cause the confusion. In this point, as in not a few others, Flavius Josephus agrees with the Septuagint. He usually does agree with the Septuagint over the Masoretic, by the way. For he makes Saul bid the priest take the garments of his high priesthood, of which garments the ephod was the most essential. So, rather interesting, the scholars are pretty certain the Septuagint is right and the Masoretic is incorrect. And the reason for the difference is simply a small change in the vowels of the words used in the text. How much confusion would have been avoided if they had invented vowel points earlier as part of their alphabet, like we have in the English alphabet, vowels. But it was only in the 7th century AD the vowel points began to be generally used in Hebrew. Imagine that 700 years after Yeshua, before of suffering through all of this mayhem, before they finally said, "Well, we got to do something about this. We have to invent some kind of way of putting in vowels." And after all this time, who knows if the way they put the vowels in, the vowel points in, is correct? And something was written in 1500 BC or 2000 BC, time of Abraham, 1850 BC. Who knows in 700 AD if you're putting the vowels in the right place that Abraham would have put them, for example. Well, let's move on. In 1 Samuel 20, and verse 30, the King James says, "Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness?" Now, the Septuagint is different. It says, "And Saul was exceedingly angry with Jonathan, and said to him, Thou son of traitorous damsels." And the literal Greek of the Septuagint, according to the commentary, is immodest babies. In other words, sexually loose or prostitutes or something like that. Anyway, instead of just a rebellious woman. Platon's Josephus indicates that there was an existence of a legend now unknown to us, when he says in Antiquities, Book 5, Chapter 11, verse 9, that Jonathan was born of runagates, in other words, sexually immoral woman. 1 Samuel 9:25, King James says, "And when they were come down from the high place into the city, Samuel communed with Saul upon the top of the house." The Septuagint says, "And he went down from Bama into the city, and he prepared a lodging for Saul on the roof, and he lay down." So, which was it? The King James says, Samuel communed with Saul up on the roof, and the Septuagint says he prepared a lodging, bed, place for him to sleep. And according to commentaries, the difference between the two interpretations is all dependent upon confusion between Resh and Dalet. Those two very similar Hebrew letters that look so much alike, Resh and Dalet. Depending on which letter you take it to be, tells you whether he communed or whether he made a bed on the roof. 2 Samuel 17, verse 8, King James says, "And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me." And the Septuagint says, "He stood and cried to the army of Israel, and said to them, Why are ye come forth to set yourselves in battle array against us? Am I not a Philistine, and ye Hebrews of Saul?" So the Masoretic says, "servants of Saul," and the Septuagint says, "Hebrews of Saul." So you take your pick on that. Interesting about this, though, is my daughter goes to a women's Bible study group, and one day she came home to me, and after Bible study, he said, "I learned some things today I bet you don't know." She says, Gideon is only mentioned by name one time in the Old Testament, and whenever it mentions him, it always says the Philistine, and whenever it mentions the Philistine, it always had something else with it. And anyway, I looked it up, and that is true. Goliath appeared 6 times by name, according to the King James Bible, and twice by name without whatever, I forgot now what it was associated with his name. But anyway, there was a lot of stuff being taught out there that that's not true. and people trust their ministers. I say, go look it up, which I did. I had a correct daughter. So anyway, First Samuel 23 verse 18 says in the King James, and they two made a covenant before Yahuwah, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. Then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, doth not David hide himself with us in the strongholds in the wood? Well, the Septuagint says they both made a covenant before Yahuwah, and David dwelt in Cayenne. So the Septuagint takes the word translated wood in the Masoretic as being a proper name. Cayenne. C-A-E-N-E. And in verse 19, the Septuagint says, and the Ziphites came up out of the dry country to Saul to the hill. That's rather odd if it's dry country. Why would they have a wood? Big trees, big water. Whatever. Anyway, came to Saul on the hill saying, behold, is not David hidden with us in Massah, again we're taking it as a proper name, in the narrows in Cayenne, in the hill of Keilah, which is on the right of Jessamine. So in this 23rd chapter for Samuel, verse 18, 19, it makes them, they render the word for a thick wood as if it was a proper name in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint translators apparently had some topographical ignorance when translating this, and didn't know if there was woods at this place or not. These are the proper name apparently, and led them to render names as though there were significant words and change ordinary words into proper names. 1 Samuel 31 verse 3, and the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. The Septuagint says he was wounded under the ribs. So Septuagint adds the word under the ribs, which may have been in the original Hebrew text, and may not have. Maybe it was removed by the Masoretes. No, who knows? 1 Samuel 12 and verse 3, King James says, behold, here I am, witness against me before Yahuwah, and before his anointed, whose ox have I taken? We went through this just recently on Saturday. You may remember this? Whose ox have I taken? Or whose ass have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Of whose hand have I received any bribe? To blind mine eyes therewith, and I will restore it to you. Now Septuagint, instead of to blind mine eyes, says, whose calf have I taken? Whose ass have I taken? Of whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe? Even to a sandal. Bear with witness against me, and I will make restitution to you. So one version says, to blind mine eyes. Septuagint says, a bribe even to a sandal. And I looked this up. The commentators say, Samuel challenges his opponents to name anyone from whom he has received a bribe, to blind mine eyes therewith, or as it is rendered more literally in the margin, that I should hide mine eyes at him. The Septuagint, however, reads, a bribe or a pair of shoes. Answer me. The change required for this sense in the Hebrew is extremely slight. And when we compare such passages as Amos 2:6 and Amos 8:6, which says that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes, it may be doubtful whether here the Septuagint are not right. So a double negative there is saying the Septuagint is the correct version. Their reading was also adopted by Jesus, the son of Sirach, in the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus 46, verse 19, who says of Samuel that before his long sleep he made protestation to the sight of the Lord his anointed, I have not taken any man's good so much as a shoe, and no man did accuse him. So it was a Hebrew euphemism in those days to say, show your honesty by saying, I have taken so much as a shoe. I can say that. I can make my shoe. And interesting, these expressions. We have our own expressions today. They had their expressions as well. And apparently that expression got lost in translation in the King James Version. So in time here, we'll close with that. We'll get the other half, continue on in 1 Samuel with some other interesting differences, I think, on Thursday, and also go into the patriarchs and how the Masoretes, how and why the Masoretes changed the ages of the patriarchs in the King James Bible, and the reason for it. We'll go into that on Thursday. Questions?